Welcome to Grimcast Radio, where we bring you stories that are eerie, unsettling, and sometimes way too real. If you like horror with a touch of mystery, you're in the right place. So sit back, keep the lights on if you must, and let's get into it.
Hello. Today I'm posting a message on this website because I'm in search of answers. I moved into my new apartment just 2 months ago. About a week ago, I removed the wallpaper in order to paint the walls, and I realized that in one spot the wallpaper was covering a hole in which I found a notebook. The hole was deep in the wall, but the thickness of the notebook filled its entire width, making the hole completely invisible once it was covered. There's no name or date on it. I haven't mentioned it to the landlord because he is unreachable, and I can't contact the previous tenants without going through him. If someone could provide even a hint as to what is in this notebook, I would be very grateful. Below is the transcription of its contents.
Today I went down to the basement for the first time since I started living here. I wanted to bring down my old TV stand. It isn't damaged, but I found another one I liked better, so I decided to bring it down, maybe to sell it or give it to someone. When I arrived in the basement, despite the very dim light, I found my storage locker rather quickly because it bears my apartment number. It was at the far end of the corridor, facing me, unlike the others, which were arranged facing each other along the sides. Just before opening the door, I noticed what sounded like snoring coming from inside. I waited for at least 10 minutes until it stopped. At that moment, I looked between the planks of the door and saw something moving on all fours across the width of the locker. As its eyes caught the light, I could see that it was looking at me. It was breathing heavily too, as if its throat were constricted. After what felt like an eternity, it crawled toward me very quickly. It pressed its head against the door at the level of my own and sniffed me. Its breath reeked of a dead rat, urine, and damp earth. I raced back upstairs in the blink of an eye. I don't know what it is, but it terrifies me, and yet I'm so eager to know. I can't stop thinking about it. Today I went back down to the basement with a flashlight to try to get a better look at this thing through the gaps in the door. When I arrived, I first looked without the light. The creature was curled up, pressed against the middle of the back wall, and it looked as if it were sleeping. Then I turned on the flashlight and held it against the door at a spot where the planks separated. I was only able to see it for 1 or 2 seconds before it scurried off into a dark corner, crawling while emitting a low growl. Part of the light hit its eyes directly and suddenly woke it up. This thing resembles a woman old and desiccated. Its skin is gray and cracked, and it is horrifically emaciated. It looks like a corpse. I even thought I saw its ribs and the bones of its elbows protruding. The nails on its hands are black and broken, hardly surprising given that it crawls by clinging to the floor and pushing itself along on its feet. But the worst part remains its face. Its skull is scattered with tufts of long, extremely fine white hair. The entire front quarter of the right side of its head is devoid of skin. You can see the bone jutting out, surrounded by ragged edges of rotten black flesh. Its eyes have no eyelids, merely 2 large, gleaming black orbs, far too big and sunken into its skull. It doesn't even have a nose, although the shape of the hole where one should be suggests there ought to be one. And its mouth, my God, its mouth. It has no lips and only a few large, broken teeth, yellow or black and very unevenly spaced. Some are square, others pointed, but not in any natural arrangement, as if they had been deliberately broken to look that way. Moreover, they are not aligned at all. Its gums are dark red and swollen, as if covered in tumors, and they ooze a sticky, dark yellow-green liquid that appears to have formed a crust at the base of its teeth. The expression on its face is one of anger, as if it were a predator about to attack. This thing looks dangerous. I don't know what to do. Besides, who would believe me if I talked about it? I can't stop thinking about this thing. I replay its image in my mind, imagining it living in that locker, eating any insects that come within its reach and occasionally catching a rat. I picture its teeth sinking into the rodent's flesh, the pressure bursting the tumors on its gums and releasing the yellow-green liquid in a little crack. Then I see its teeth tearing out the entrails of the little animal from its belly while it's still alive, writhing in pain and fear, squealing like a rubber toy. The more I think about it, the more I find something noble, even beautiful, about this creature. I've been going down to the basement at least once every day for several days now. I tap on the door to let the thing know I'm there, and I sit cross-legged with my back and head pressed against the door. At first it was wary, probably because of the sudden burst of light from the flashlight, but little by little it began to approach the door more and more, until finally it started sniffing me. Yesterday, it even slid its fingers between the planks to touch my shoulders and hair. I think it's beginning to get used to me. To be honest, I'm getting used to it too, and in the end, its breath isn't so unpleasant after all. I knew it, it's become accustomed to me, and for several days now when I arrive, I can hear it coming to the door as I cross the basement. It knows it's me, it even seems happy to see me. Now every time it slips its fingers between the planks to touch me, even trying to catch my gaze. In response, I touch its fingers so that it knows I trust it. I think I might soon try to go inside. I did it today. I opened the door and went into the locker. Of course, I made sure to close the door carefully behind me. I sat cross-legged at the far end of the room. It wasn't very comfortable because there were lots of little bones on the floor, probably the remains of the creature's past meals. It crawled toward me, then squatted right in front of me. It spent a long while sniffing me, but eventually it touched my face, as if a blind person were trying to form an image of someone, which is odd because its eyes shine in the dark. That would normally mean it can see in the darkness. Nonetheless, I let it do as it wished, and everything went fine. My upstairs neighbor is spying on me. Today, while I was coming down the stairs, she opened her door just as I passed by her place. She told me it was enough, that every day she hears me coming down to the basement, and she asked what on earth I was doing down there. I told her to mind her sagging, flabby ass and leave useful people to live as they please. She was so shocked that she went back inside and locked her door. You old bitch. I owe her nothing, not one bit. Yesterday, my poor little thing looked terribly unwell. I didn't know what was wrong with it. It was leaning against the back wall, its arms hanging by its sides when I arrived. It was making sounds like cries of pain. I tried to figure out what was wrong. It didn't appear injured or anything. In any case, it must have understood that I was trying to help because it eventually looked at me and pointed with its open mouth. I immediately understood that it was hungry. So I brought down a ribeye I had in the fridge. I thought it would prefer it raw, and I was right. From now on, I'm going to bring it food every day so that it lacks nothing. And at least, since it doesn't seem to defecate, or maybe it's scatophagic, I won't have to clean up. Everything is going well with my little thing. It eats properly and seems to be in good shape. The only problem is that damn neighbor. She's talking about me to the other tenants, but since they probably think she's half crazy, no one takes her seriously. It's incredible how much her accusing look and the trembling skin on her neck irritate me. I feel like knocking her out, and I don't like the way she looks at me. I don't know who she thinks she's impressing, that old bitch. I spoke with a neighbor today, a really nice guy. We talked about the old lady upstairs. He told me with an amused air that she was telling everyone I was keeping something in my basement, but he reassured me by explaining that she was just a half-crazy gossip, trying only to make herself interesting, and that no one really listened to her. On that point, he was right. He also said that I might as well be housing a troll down there since it had been years since anyone went down. I even made up an excuse that I was doing renovation work at home and storing glue and paint down there because I couldn't stand the smell, just to avoid raising any suspicion. My thing and I are really starting to bond. Now when I go down, it comes to stick to me. It caresses me. It even tries to kiss my neck, though of course it can't since it has no lips. Today I returned its caresses. I touched its chest. It was rough and sagging, and yet I think it liked it. As for me, I'm certain that I enjoyed it. It deserves better than dead meat. Today I grabbed the cat of that old bitch upstairs while it was sitting on her windowsill, and I brought it to her. It emitted grunts of joy and throat-clearing sounds when it saw it. It ate the cat down to the very last piece, leaving nothing but its skeleton. When it was finished, it leaped on me and held me in its arms as if to thank me. I think it's time to take our relationship to the next level. For several days now, I've been catching animals on the street to feed it, stray cats, poorly supervised dogs. Each time, it's happy to feast on fresh, pulsating, bloody meat. And yet, I want to offer it something truly special. Last night was magnificent. On my way home, I saw a mother searching for something in the compartment of her stroller. Since she had lost sight of her baby, I seized the opportunity. I grabbed the kid and ran as fast as I could to my building. I heard her calling for help behind me, but I was already out of her sight. In fact, she couldn't even see me because just after taking the kid, I turned behind a building. However, that little brat wouldn't stop screaming. Besides, he was really ugly, with a bulldog face, a big head, and snot dripping from his nose. So I hit him square in the face to make him shut up. It worked. His face swelled up and turned purple. He even bled a little, but he finally shut his big mouth. At the same time, he looked half unconscious. But anyway, moving on, I brought him to my little thing and it loved him. It even insisted on sharing its meal with me. Now I'm sure it loves me. In the morning, I caught the old lady from upstairs. I managed to knock her out. Now she's in my kitchen, a crumpled dishcloth stuffed in her mouth so that she won't scream if she wakes up. and with wire tightly bound around the lower part of her shoulders and the upper part of her thighs. That's going to cut off the blood flow in her limbs and make her easier to chew, because tonight I'm giving my dear little thing the meal of its life. It was truly the most beautiful night of my life. I took the old lady down around 11:00 p.m. and we began to eat. My little thing looked delighted. Moreover, while we were attacking the intestines and just after finishing off her 2 arms and 1 leg, the old lady came to herself. Seeing herself in that state, she tried to cry out and began to sob. That made me laugh a lot, and my little thing loved it. As she was becoming annoying, after a while we decided to open up her skull to share its contents. We looked each other straight in the eyes while eating, and finally, whatever happened, I laid her on her back and lowered my pants to make love to her. It hurt when I penetrated her. There was resistance and it was cutting me, and yet I couldn't stop even though it was difficult. She writhed her limbs, emitting inhuman screams and grunts. Her head swayed from left to right, and her tongue, a long strip of black flesh, seemed to move on its own as it emerged from her mouth. After a while I finally came and I withdrew from her. She remained lying on her back, breathing in short, hissing gasps and making loud gargling noises with her throat. It was magical. The other tenants in the building are starting to wonder about me. It's time to rejoin my dear little thing in the basement. I'll manage to come out from time to time because one has to eat. At least down there, they will never come looking for me. I'm not going to destroy my notes. I'll simply hide them somewhere in my apartment. Our story is too beautiful to be erased, and who knows, perhaps one day someone will read these lines and understand what true love is.
Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the story, and hopefully you didn't get too attached to that little thing in the basement, because, well, yikes. Now, on to our next story. I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a call center, but let's just say some calls are downright unnerving. And in this next story, one particular call turns from routine to something else entirely. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive in.
For several years, I worked as a call center agent. I spent my days calling people, trying to sell them various things. I'm sure all of you have received this kind of call at least once in your lives. A telephone operator, for example, trying to sell you a mobile plan. Let's be honest, we could all do without these calls. We've all felt that urge, myself included, before I switched sides, to tell the guy or gal trying to push their offer to get lost. Very often, the person on the other end doesn't even have time to finish their introductory sentence before we've already hung up or blurted out, "I'm not interested, goodbye." Couldn't stand those kinds of calls. Then one day I received a job offer to become the guy who calls people all day. When I took my first calls, I realized something. Many people seem unaware that a human being is calling them. It's as if they think we're soulless, heartless robots incapable of feeling any emotion. I do exactly as I'm told. I follow the script given to me, and I don't decide whom I should or shouldn't call. As a result, I often got shut down, and not always very politely. That wasn't the only downside of the job. It was repetitive, too. We kept saying the same thing over and over, and the days were long. There were, however, some positives. Whenever I managed to sell a subscription to someone I didn't even know from Adam to Eve, I must admit I was filled with a sense of pride. That didn't completely erase the inconveniences, but over time I got used to it. I had developed my little routines. Then one day a phone call turned my life upside down. This was about a year ago. That call terrified me. I lost sleep for several weeks. I had already encountered my share of oddities during my many years of loyal service at the call center. But this time I was seriously freaked out, to the point that for the first time in my career I had to take several weeks off on sick leave. I was traumatized. It was a Friday, nearly at the end of my shift. It must have been around 7:30 p.m. We were nearing the end of our call list, so there were a lot of answering machines and quite a bit of waiting time between calls. I'd been waiting for 3 minutes when a new contact finally appeared. I began as usual. "Hello, this is Max from sales." The man on the other end of the phone interrupted me, telling me to stop immediately. Up to that point, nothing unusual. This happens often. I paused for a second to listen to what he had to say. Usually people who say that go on to complain either about the calls or to insist that they aren't interested. But this time he said nothing. I could only hear his heavy breathing, so I continued. I'm calling you to. Shut up, Max. My irritation began to mount. It was the end of the day, and although I was used to rude people, this was really getting on my nerves. You have to understand that as call center agents, we have strict guidelines not to talk down to our clients, and no matter what they say, we're supposed to remain polite and courteous. So even though I felt like telling that idiot to get lost, I simply replied, Sir, I apologize if... He cut me off again. Stop calling me Max, I don't like it. Sir, it's an automated system calling you. Perhaps you received a call from one of my colleagues. No, I know it's you calling me all the time, Max. While speaking and listening to him, I checked the call history. I began to feel uneasy. He was right, it was always my name on the record. I had always sent him to voicemail. He had never answered before, this was the first time. To you it might not seem strange at all, but I assure you it wasn't normal that I was always the one reaching this guy. On a call platform there are several teams. In mine there were nearly 20 people. The calls are distributed randomly by software among the available agents. Logically, my name shouldn't have been the only one showing up in the history. The system had already called him 8 times that month, and it was always me who got through, never one of my colleagues. I tried to reassure myself by thinking that perhaps the software was malfunctioning. It wouldn't have been the first time. The fact that my name appeared systematically must have been a bug, and the guy had no way of knowing that. The same number was always calling him, and that annoyed him. He wasn't singling me out specifically. If we contact you, it's because... He interrupted me once more. I told you to shut up, Tom. I was stunned. Max is just a pseudonym I use among many others. My real name is Tom. How could he know that? I'm Max, sir. I tried to control my voice. I didn't want to let on how disturbed I was. No, you're Tom, and you keep calling me. I don't like it. I'll make sure this never happens again. I wasn't quite sure I understood what he meant, whether he was actually threatening me. My eyes were fixed on his name as I tried to recall if I recognized it from somewhere, or if it wasn't just a bad joke from a friend who recognized my voice. But no matter how hard I looked, his name was completely unknown to me. He continued. I know you call me from a call center in Northern England. That was true too, but I tried to console myself by thinking that Northern England was vague, and to my knowledge, several companies work in telemarketing. Except then he gave me the exact city and the name of the company where I worked. He even detailed my work schedule. I was supposed to be off the following Thursday, and he told me he would find me then. All I wanted to do was hang up, but you're not allowed to hang up on a customer. I still tell myself that if I had hung up, no one would have blamed me. It was an exceptional case. Instead, I sat there like an idiot, eyes glued to the computer, continuing to listen. I'll make you stop harassing people. Your navy blue scarf will be very useful to shut your big mouth. Then he hung up. I was paralyzed. Needless to say, I was indeed wearing a navy blue scarf. I sat there doing nothing for a good 5 minutes, my hands trembling. My colleagues noticed that something was wrong and asked what was happening. Since the calls were recorded, my supervisor listened to the conversation. I still hoped it was a joke, that my boss would say, "It's nothing, don't worry." But instead, I saw him break down as the recording played. The police were contacted. I was interrogated to confirm that I truly didn't know who my caller was. An investigation took place, and afterward I refused to go back to work. My doctor put me on sick leave. I was placed under police surveillance, especially on that infamous Thursday when the man said he'd find me. Nothing happened that day, nor on the following days. The investigation led nowhere. They never managed to track down the guy. The number I'd been calling was no longer in service, and the name didn't match any current or former customer of the operator I worked for. Even now, I have no idea who that man was. I had to take medication to calm myself down. I was so stressed. I was forced to take sleeping pills just to get some rest. I kept having the same nightmare, the guy breaking into my home to kill me. Several weeks later, I managed to pull myself together and went back to work. I could have changed jobs. I might even have needed to change then, but I don't have any qualifications, and I really didn't know what else I could do. The first day and even the first week went about normally. I was still anxious, but to a lesser degree than during my sick leave. Then after several weeks, I had nearly recovered from that horrible experience. 2 months later, I was moved to a different shift, which meant I would be working for another operator. After a few days of training with new colleagues, we set off to make calls. 2 weeks after that, the nightmare began again. Around 6:00 p.m., a new contact appeared. It was under a woman's name. I began my pitch, and this time I was using the pseudonym Alex. There was a sigh on the other end of the line. Nothing unusual, this sort of thing happens quite often. I continued, presenting the purpose of my call. Fiber had been installed in her town. "Is that you again, Tom?" It was the same voice as before. I was petrified, unable to move or utter a word. How was it that I kept getting this psycho? It wasn't the same name, I was sure of it. I had been traumatized enough not to forget it. He continued. "I missed our appointment. You were too surrounded. For a brief moment I even considered being lenient. But you've called me 6 times now, Tom. I'm not going to let this slide. See you soon." He hung up. I checked the call history, and once again he was right. I had called him 5 times before today, and I had always sent him straight to voicemail. The nightmare was repeating itself. I reported it again to my superiors, and another investigation took place, but unsurprisingly it led nowhere. It was impossible to trace this man. That very day I decided to quit. I never set foot in a call center again. Weeks and months passed. I found a job as a sales clerk in a shop. I thought I was finally done with all that when one day a blocked number called my cell phone. I answered automatically. "Don't think I've forgotten you, Tom. Nice leather jacket." It was him. I hung up immediately. He didn't try to call back. I thought I was going to faint from terror. How had he gotten my cell number? The most terrifying part was that I actually did own a leather jacket. He was out there somewhere and he was watching me. I looked around. There were people everywhere. I was in a shopping mall, but no one seemed to be staring or watching me. I blended into the crowd, and once outside the mall, I ran to the nearest police station. I figured that if I ran fast enough, no matter where that guy was, I'd manage to shake him off. Once again, the police were of no help. It was impossible to trace the call, of course. After that, I changed my number and even moved to another region, hoping that would be enough to escape that lunatic. I have panic attacks every time my phone rings. For a while, I even considered giving up having a cell phone altogether. It has been 5 months since that last call. Nothing has happened since. I keep trying to convince myself it was just a tasteless joke. Having changed my number and moved, I tell myself there's no way for that guy to find me. And yet I'm writing all of this today because I need help. For the past 2 hours, my cell phone hasn't stopped ringing. It's a blocked number and I'm too scared to answer. It's the middle of the night and I'm too afraid to leave my home. I'm sure it's him and that he's watching me from somewhere.
Hey listeners, we're not done yet. This next story will make you question just how far madness can go, and if there even are any limits. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. My husband and I loved each other deeply, but like most couples, we argued. Our biggest fights always revolved around one single topic: children. I desperately wanted them. He didn't. Over the years, I had hoped he would change his mind and come around to the idea of starting a family, but he remained stubborn and refused to reconsider. I reminded him time and time again that if we waited too long, we might never be able to conceive our own child, but he didn't seem to care. I even suggested adoption, but he wouldn't hear of it. "You're not fit to be a mother," he said. His cruel words are now forever burned into my memory. I loved him. Why would he say something like that? I wanted to carry a baby. I wanted life inside me, a little piece of him growing within me. I love my husband, but he had no right to deny me that. No one did. I threw away my birth control pills and sabotaged his condoms. Just as I was preparing to seduce him in a frenzy of passion, my husband, who knew how desperate I was to have a life inside me, discovered my plan and rejected my advances. My own husband called me crazy, said I was obsessed, and losing my mind. I loved him so much. How could he say such horrible things to me? I was his wife, after all. That night, I cried. I had never cried so much in my entire life. He had no right to do this to me. I would carry the life I longed for. It took me a week, but I had my next plan ready. It was foolproof. There was nothing he could do. This time, he wouldn't stop me. When he got home from work, I handed him a beer, one I had laced with sleeping pills. Of course, he didn't taste the medication as he eagerly gulped down his drink. 20 minutes later, he was in a deep, almost unconscious sleep. I dragged him to our bedroom and onto the bed. I stripped him of his clothes and began kissing every inch of his body. "You won't stop me this time," I whispered into his ear as he remained blissfully unaware of what was about to happen. Hours passed as I took care of him. Not once did he wake from his forced slumber. Not once did he feel my warm lips pressing constantly against his now cold skin. I savored every sensation as I carefully carried out my task. The sheets were soaked after my night's work, but it wasn't sweat that drenched them. It was my husband's blood. I sat on the bedroom floor, my back resting against the foot of our bed. Tenderly, I ran my hands over my stomach, delighted with the life I was finally carrying. I wouldn't get to cherish this life inside me for 9 whole months, like most women. But the few days I would have with it in my belly would be the best of my existence. It's not easy to devour an entire human being in a single night. But it was worth it, because now I finally have a piece of my husband inside me. Up next, we have a story about childhood curiosity and something lurking just beyond sight. A boy raised in a strict home spends every Halloween watching from behind a window. But one year, what he sees changes everything. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the ones hiding in plain sight.
As a Christian, I never really celebrated Halloween. Few people know this, but for us, it's a dark tradition, and the most devout believers flat out refuse to let their children take part in it. I was one of those kids, the ones who missed out on trick or treating while their classmates gushed about it at the start of every school year, their eyes full of excitement. Every year, on the night of October 31st, I would lean against the living room window and watch other children parade outside, laughing, dressed up from head to toe. Honestly, it didn't make me all that sad. My mother had taught me that taking part in a pagan tradition like this would be a betrayal of our allegiance to God. That explanation was enough for me, and so, year after year, until I was 12, I simply observed with quiet fascination this foreign custom. The first time I found myself watching this parade of costumed kids collecting candy, I was 5 years old. While playing in the living room, I suddenly turned my head when I heard a cry of joy outside and ran to the window. In the street, I saw 3 kids older than me, dressed as a wizard, a mummy, and a pumpkin, gleefully marveling at the contents of the bags they held. Looking closer, I realized their bags were full of colorful, eye-catching wrappers. It didn't take me long to figure out what was going on. Fascinated by these costumed kids and their loot, I immediately called my mother to show her, and that's when she explained to me that it was a pagan tradition. A little disappointed, I nodded and turned back to the window to keep watching the witches and demons, fairies and magicians, until I was pulled away from my contemplation and sent to bed. From that day on, year after year, I repeated the same ritual, captivated by the eerie yet festive spectacle unfolding beneath my window. Sometimes, the children would scare the neighborhood with their shrill screams before running away, laughing. Other times, they were accompanied by adults in costumes just as elaborate, cheerfully repeating the famous phrase, "trick or treat." When I was 8, Halloween started to become a major topic at school as the end of October approached. I had to turn down several invitations from friends who wanted me to join them that year. Of course, they laughed at my reasons, but I didn't care. I would continue to watch from my window, a mix of awe and curiosity in my heart. I think what fascinated me the most were the costumes. Each year, while many participants stuck to the usual disguises, some made a real effort to outdo themselves in creativity. I saw a killer clown so lifelike that he came with a buzzing chainsaw, a Frankenstein monster so terrifying it could make the devil himself pale, and a mad doctor straight out of an asylum escape scene. But there were two particular Halloweens that stood out among the rest. The first was when I was 9. As usual, when night fell, I settled at the living room window, my eyes glued to the street. My mother had started giving me a few candies on Halloween night to make up for the fact that I couldn't participate. So there I was, sucking on a caramel while watching the growing darkness, where cheerful little monsters scurried about, collecting handfuls of sweets. I didn't remember it until much later, but it all started with a faint, distant thud echoing down the street. Then, about 5 minutes later, the groaning began. Horrible, guttural, barely articulated moans of pain that grew closer, step by step. And then I saw him. About 20 meters away, under the glow of a street lamp, he stopped. My first instinct was to widen my eyes in admiration at the sheer detail of his costume. He wore gray jeans and a beige sweater, both stained with blood that glistened under the light. And his mask, the upper half looked normal, eyes and a nose, though smeared with red. But the lower half, it was a shattered jaw with teeth missing in uneven gaps and strips of flesh hanging loosely where a chin should have been. I had seen many costumes before, but never had I witnessed such dedication to realism. Then I noticed the children. They weren't admiring his costume. They were running, screaming in terror as he resumed his slow, agonized shuffle toward a neighbor's front door. A few seconds later, my mother burst into the room and ordered me to go to my bedroom. You've probably guessed by now, he wasn't wearing a mask. My childlike eyes and the dim street lamp's glow had played a cruel trick on me. It wasn't until years later that my mother told me what really happened that night. A street away from our home, a man had tried to end his life with a bullet under his chin, but had failed. He had blown apart his own jaw but was still alive. In shock and unable to speak or call for help, he had stumbled outside, desperately seeking assistance. But no one opened their doors. To them, his grotesque appearance and unintelligible gurgling sounded more like an attack than a plea for aid. A neighbor finally called the police when they saw him staggering down our street, his torn mouth struggling to form words, his hands reaching out to strangers who recoiled in horror. By the time the police arrived, my mother had already dragged me away from the window, alarmed by the flashing lights. They took the poor man to the hospital, but he died from blood loss on the way. Even now, I wonder, if someone had opened their door and understood what was happening, could he have survived? That Halloween didn't disturb me much at the time. I was too young to grasp what had really happened. But 3 years later, when I was 12, something even stranger occurred. That year, a new neighbor, let's call him Mr. Carter, moved into the house across the street. My mother invited him to dinner, eager to be welcoming. Mr. Carter was a man in his 40s who, we learned that evening, had moved after a difficult divorce. Despite everything, he was funny, and his graying mustache gave him a warm, fatherly charm. My mother and I both liked him. On Halloween night, I had a direct view of his house from my window. He had gone all out, string lights, carved pumpkins, even an animatronic Grim Reaper. It was the best decorated house on the block. Kids came and went, trick-or-treating at every door, and Mr. Carter, dressed as Count Dracula, handed out candy with a broad smile. If I hadn't known it was him, I wouldn't have even recognized him under the elaborate costume. Then something strange happened. A pair of kids dressed as trolls knocked on his door. Mr. Carter reached into his candy bowl but quickly withdrew his hand, realizing it was empty. He hesitated, then gestured for them to come inside, probably to grab more candy. The children stepped in. The door shut behind them. I barely thought about it, but as the night wore on, more kids knocked and no one answered. An hour later, his garage door opened and his car sped off, with two small silhouettes in the back seat. It wasn't until the next day that I learned the truth from the news. A man had kidnapped two children on Halloween night. He had been on trial for child abuse, separated from his children by the court. That night, he had lured them inside, disguised himself, and planned to flee the country. But the police caught up to him. In a panic, he lost control of the car and crashed into a tree, killing himself and the children. His name, Mr. Carter, and I had watched it all happen. Even now, I wonder, if I had spoken up, could I have saved them?
And that wraps up the very first episode of Grimcast Radio. Hope you enjoyed our selection of stories. There's plenty more where that came from. New episodes drop 3 times a week, so stay tuned.